Hi, my name is Pop. I'm making an entertaining video about Gottfried Lessing's Not an der Weise. This was a play written in German about the three religions in the Middle East and which one is the right religion. If you go online to Google, you can see that Not an der Weise was written in 1763 and it has many references, but it's not well known today. The three religions are vying for supremacy. One of them's right and two of them are wrong. Which one is right? What do you do about the two that are wrong? It takes place during the Crusades, 200-year war in the Middle East, and it was fought in the Middle East, the cradle of the three great monotheistic religions, against a backdrop of all sorts of politics. If you go back several thousand years, it's interesting. A monotheistic religion called Jews started up in the Holy Land, and they spoke a different language and were of a slightly different racial group and had a different religion, and this caused friction. And then they broke off into a splinter group called Christians. Now, normally, the non-monotheistic group, the Arabs, would have joined the Christians, but they could not do so because in order to become a Christian in those days, you first then had to become a Jew, and they didn't want to do that. To complicate matters further, the world was dominated by the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire didn't like either Jews, Arabs, Christians, anybody else. But eventually the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as its own religion. Slightly thereafter, it totally collapsed, and all of Europe went into the Dark Ages. Simultaneously, a new religion rose among the Arabs, the Moslem religion, and now you had something new occurring. Europe had been plunged into a sort of a barbarianism, whereas the Muslims had retained the knowledge of ancient times, and they then were growing in number and had a great amount of wealth and were migrating into Europe. Now this frightened the Christians no end, and that started the Crusades. And now the Crusades were fighting it out in the Middle East. Christians against Muslims, and the poor Jews were caught in the middle. This was the worst war in the history of wars. It made Nagasaki and Hiroshima look tame. It made the firebombing of Dresden and the Battle of St. Petersburg and Stalingrad look like nothing at all. It was the worst of the worst. We have many depictions of it. Most of these are Western depictions. Strangely enough, none of our paintings paint it in a glorious light from the standpoint of the supremacy of Christianity. Even we here in the West who painted these pictures depict this as a horror show, and it was. Well, here are some photographs of some of the plays of Nathan the Wise, and it's not so popular today, but I want to tell this one story in it, and it's really neat. You've got a lot of analysis of the play, and you can see here the Moslem general Saladin. I got to tell this story against the backdrop of Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac. In the Bible, you've got this story about Abraham being ordered by God to sacrifice his kid Isaac. And he is quite willing to do so, and the whole point of the story is that God stops him and says, "You don't gotta sacrifice kids anymore." And Christianity tells us, well, see, what that means is that Jesus sacrificed himself instead of us having to do so anymore. But hey, we're still doing it. I mean, we give young men either an M16 or an AK-47, and we send them over there to the altar to get sacrificed for various noble causes. Whatever our noble cause happens to be, we might say it's for Western civilization or Christianity or democracy or jihad or land, whatever it is, but we're still sacrificing those kids, and it has now become a cartoon. Here is the General Saladin, and he's a well-known figure in history, fighting Richard the Lionheart, who came from England, and Richard the Lionheart left his brother behind, King John, and you all know the story of King John and Robin Hood and the Magna Carta, but Richard the Lionheart was in the Middle East, and he thought that he had to be over there to save Western civilization and Christianity from the Moslems. This is the story of the three rings. There was a lull in the battle, and Saladin started to have time to contemplate what has been going on for 20 years or so. His whole life he's been a soldier, and he's led 100,000 young men into slaughter. And he believes in his religion. It's a religion of peace, and he says, what in the hell have I been doing? And he happens to know that Richard the Lionheart is a man just like himself, who probably is now also sitting around brooding, saying, what in the hell have I been doing? And he's got to be thinking, could I be wrong? And he knows also that Richard the Lionheart is thinking, could I be wrong? Could we both be wrong? Are we following the devil, or are we following God? What are we doing? But then he has an idea, and he remembers that there's this old man in the marketplace called Nathan the Wise. He's an old Jew. So he tells his soldiers, hey man, go arrest that old Jew called Nathan the Wise and bring him here to me. I want to ask him a question. So they go get Nathan, and Nathan says, well, what do you want from me? Come on. So Saladin, he gets Nathan in front of him, and he says, hey, listen, don't be worried about this. I just want to ask you a question, and however you answer, your life depends on it. Which of these religions is the right religion? So Nathan, he knows his life's on the line, and he can't just say something stupid like, well, you know, I was born a Jew, and my mom was a Jew and stuff, so hey, I'm a Jew. Off with his head. And he certainly cannot say, oh, well, you know, sir, I was thinking about converting to Islam, and, you know, today's as good a day as it. Off with his head. And he certainly can't say Christianity is the correct religion. So how is he going to answer? This is a tough one. So he does. He answers this question. He says, once upon a time, there was a father with 3 sons. And, of course, Saladin, being a resident of the Middle East and knowing spiritual symbolism, he knew immediately that the father was a symbol for God and the 3 sons was a symbol for the 3 religions. And he said this father, he loved his 3 sons, and the 3 sons were altogether different. They had different personalities and different characteristics. But there was a problem. The father knew he was getting old, and he had to leave the 3 sons on their own. And these sons were not great sons. They were always squabbling and stuff and fighting. And there was another problem. The father had this gold ring, and the gold ring was his legacy, and the legacy was kind of magic. I mean, in those days, you had to give your legacy, your one and only gold ring, to one of the boys, and you couldn't give it to three boys. And this was a magic ring, since this is a sort of a magic story. And the ring, when possessed by somebody, bestowed upon the owner all of these great attributes, and I have not named them all here. I was making this video and I got tears in my eyes. I couldn't think of them all. Grace, goodness, mercy, wisdom. What? Wealth, power, love, truth? What are they? I don't know. I could name 100. I don't know which ones are important, which ones are right. Well, the old man's passing a jeweler, and he gets this idea, and he goes in, he says, "Hey man, can you make me a couple copies?" He says, "Sure I can, that's what I do." So he comes back Tuesday, and there's 2 more rings. And heck, he can't even tell the difference. So one by one, he calls in his sons individually, secretly, and he says, "Listen, here, I want to give you something before I die and stuff. Don't tell your brothers and don't fight. Put it in your pocket, keep your mouth shut. Please, you know I love you, and you know I love your brothers. And I want you as brothers to love each other." Well, he dies, and what happens? Those stupid morons start fighting. Even at the funeral, they're battling it out. And I mean, how does it begin? Well, one of them, while the old man's being planted in the ground, reaches in his pocket and wiggles the ring, and to show off to his brothers. And the brother sees it, and he says, "What?" And he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out the ring, and they got 3 rings, and now they're really fighting. And they come across this receipt, and the receipt says 2 gold rings, Abdul's jewelry shop. Well, they go back to the jeweler, and they got these 3 rings, and they said, "Hey man, did you make these?" And he says, yeah, old man come in here, and he said to make me a couple of copies." And they said, "Well, which ones are the copies?" And he says, "I don't know. He told me to make them identical, so I did." And he looks at them closely, and he said, "Hey man, they're all exactly the same." And the brothers shake their heads, and they say, "No, you don't understand. One of them is a magic ring, and the other 2 are just merely gold copies. They're, fake." And the jeweler says, "Okay, well, what are the properties of the magic ring?" And they tell him. And the jeweler, he's a minor character in this story, but he's got the final word. And he says, "Well, I know how to tell the difference. I'm just a jeweler." And they said, "Well, what do we do?" And he said, "Well, each of you got a ring. Keep it. Pretend it's the real ring. And what are the qualities that ring bestows upon you?" And they said, "Well, I mean, it's going to make us each good and honest and kind-hearted and pure and benevolent." He said, "Well, the only thing I can suggest is that all of you act as though you had the real ring. And the one of you, or the 2 of you, or the 3 of you who breaks in how you act will prove that you've got the wrong ring. And for all I know, none of the rings are magic. For all I know, all 3 of them are magic. Doesn't make any difference. Act as though you had the real ring. Act as though you had been given the correct real ring by the Father." I hope you enjoyed this. My name is Pop.